All right, welcome to episode 5 of the Argue With Me podcast. I had a blast recording this conversation with Vincent Geloso, who is a professor of economics from George Mason, but also just a very animated and such a smart guy. I learned so many things in this conversation with Vincent. I can't thank him enough for discussion. We're going to be talking about in this episode, are anarcho-capitalists crazy? Now, my answer is no. You'll have to watch the episode to find out Vincent's answer. I definitely, if I had to put a label on myself as far as political views go, I think that a voluntarist, anarchist society that respects private property is probably the most sane way humans could organize themselves. I'm not as dogmatic about it, however, as some people are. My appreciation of the concept is only intertwined with how useful it is, what sort of results it might produce in the real world. And we talk about that a lot in this conversation. Whatever your beliefs are, you're going to find Vincent interesting and informative. He's an economic historian, and he's really good at both the history and the economics. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Great. All right, welcome to the Argue With Me podcast. And today I'm delighted to have Professor of Economics from George Mason University, Vincent Geloso. So thanks for joining me today. You were telling me you were doing not terrible, or what was it you
No, I'm
said?
not. I'm not doing terrible. Things are quite okay in Virginia.
Good. Yeah, they're probably a lot warmer in Virginia than they are where I am. So we are both Canadian lads, but I'm still
Yeah.
here.
Since I left for Canada for the United States, I won't lie. I've had I think 3 days of snow total in 2 years. So I am not complaining in any way whatsoever.
I'm just living vicariously through that information right now. Um, but we do want to talk about somewhere cold anyway, right? How's that for a segue? We're gonna
That's an efficient segue. Very well placed.
so Vincent wrote a paper about it's entitled "Are Ancaps Crazy?" Right? Are anarcho-capitalists crazy? And in that paper, you had an analysis of medieval Iceland. Did you want to give some backdrop as to what medieval Iceland was like and why it would possibly help to answer the question whether or not ANCAPs are crazy?
I think the answer. I'll answer the question of are ANCAP crazy. The answer is no and yes. So no, because the idea is we want to, and this is part of and I should stipulate this for your listeners. I am not interested in anarchy as a research answer. I just find it an interesting research question. Because in situations of anarchy or statelessness, I can analyze blank slates and how people create rules. And this is something I teach my students is that the production of rules is itself a productive activity. And we have to encompass everyone. So from a blank slate, I can see what people produce as rules. But we also need to do it when we look at governments, when government make rules and they already exist. The idea is that the rule maker is himself producing something, and this needs to be considered much more than it is now. So that's why it's a research question more than anything else. And the idea of stateless situations, you get blank slates to study. Medieval Iceland is one of those blank slates. So in the 9th century, migration starts towards Iceland, mostly from Norway and to a smaller degree Denmark. And the population of the island grows relatively rapidly, but it's at the end of the confines of the world for all intents and purposes, and there's very little formal rule on the island. And what you have that emerges is a very unique form of governance that pretty much everyone agrees doesn't meet the definition of what a state is. So generally, you'll find a definition of a state is a monopoly, a geographic monopoly on violence within a confined area. You do not have that in Iceland. What you have is that people across different region would be assigned would join a particular to simplify, I'm oversimplifying, would join a tribe, but it's not a tribe. Okay, I'm just using the word tribe so people understand. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Icelandic name because I can read it, I can't pronounce it. You would join a tribe, and that tribe would have essentially like a senior or a captain, and that captain you were free to move between tribes. That was the first thing. And what would happen is if you were slighted by a member of another tribe, uh, you basically your captain would defend you and then would do adjudication with the other group. But also you could sell your right if you were damaged to somebody else. So let's say like you hurt me and you're super rich and I can't really attack you. Well, I could sell it to the big guy in my tribe. He would pay me restitution directly, and then he would go on to collect from you, and I could switch allegiance between these leaders. So each of these little tribe leaders, again, I don't like to use the word tribe, but it simplifies the exposition. Each of these little tribe leaders are essentially rule makers, but that are in competition with each other. And there's no geographic component to this. I could be on the east side of Iceland, and my captain would be on the west side, but I would still have him represent me. So people would shift between groups, and that created a very strange system of governance and lawmaking. And I mean law not in the sense of legislation made by government, but law in the sense of mores, customs, traditions that emerge over 3 centuries. And it's really like it's a case of clear anarchy. But it's not a case of chaos. It is clearly there is order that's emerging in that situation. First guy to study this was David Friedman in 1979 in a super well-known article in Journal of Legal Studies, where he expounded on all of this. But Friedman left the question aside of if collaboration was sustained peacefully. And what he had found was that actually, if you looked at the murder rate in Iceland at that time, it was very low. There was a very low murder rate. It rivaled that of the United States in the 1970s, which is far lower than anywhere in Europe during the medieval period. Since then, we have data by people like Emanuel Eisner and others that gives us an estimate of homicide rates. Iceland was a very peaceful society. Despite the sagas and everything people have told, is we actually get that it was not as violent as the rest of Europe. But that doesn't mean that it was rich. It could simply be that the people are very far apart. They're not that violent. So what me and Peter Leeson did in our article is let's go one step further than Friedman. Friedman didn't check if the place was rich or poor relative to the standards of the time. Let's do that. And that was the effort of the paper. What we found was the place was actually pretty rich by the standards of the time.
Right. So, well, one quick thing. I love the fact that this is the second time in the 7 or 8 episodes I've done that Icelandic sagas are coming up. Because I had David Friedman on actually 2 episodes ago. So we weren't talking about this stuff, actually. I was asking him about his moral philosophy because I never hear him asked about that. But this is great. So Iceland, again, here we go. So you said a few things about how I could sell my rights perhaps to somebody else in a different, we're using the word tribe, even though we both know we don't mean a tribe. That sounds similar to sort of what you see today in a civil context,
Yeah.
right? So if you expect that there's going to be a big payout, but you don't have the money to litigate it, some other big guy will come along and it's worth his while to help you out in that way. Um, I just find it interesting that in a lot of cases where there is no government, it still seems like human beings can converge on similar problem solving techniques just borne out by common sense. Do you think that might be something to
I
it?
think this is where there is an organic part to creating rules. So it depends on the context. So you can see that there's very different types of laws that emerge in situations of near statelessness or statelessness period. The rules are very different by societies, and generally they're reflecting the constraints of the time, but they do have some universal component. And this is something we don't appreciate today in Western societies. Legal systems now, when you exclude civil matters, will have when it's criminal. So there's basically violence involved or theft. What the state will do is deterrence and retribution, but there is no restitution towards the injured party. Then it's brought to civil matters. In Iceland, that wasn't the case. There was actually no difference of great substance between civil and criminal. Harm was done, then there needs to be deterrence, retribution, and restitution. And so what happened was essentially like if you killed my cow or you killed my brother or I'm a woman and you killed my husband who was the primary earner, I would have the right to seek restitution. And the tribe leader, again, I don't like to use that term, but it simplifies and also it prevents me from having to pronounce Icelandic words, which
Yeah,
I would totally destroy. I know how to write it, but I can't. Again, I can't.
I totally get
I can't spell.
it.
I can't say it.
Yeah.
But I would go and see the tribe leader, and the tribe leader would seek restitution for me directly. Or, and this is something people would say, is, oh, well, then you would have highly unequal people where the rich have the right to abuse the poor. Well, no, actually, because then the poor could sell to another rich person. His right to restitution would receive immediate compensation. And then the other party would take the risk of trying to deal with the offended. So the party that bought my right, the transfer of a legal title, essentially, to the damages done for the legal claim to the restitution, then the risk was borne by the person who bought the rights.
Right.
And in that case, it created kind of a nullification mechanism, especially since people could move between tribe leaders, thus creating an imputability, an accountability mechanism that limited the bad behavior of the tribe leaders, since I could defect and go to see somebody else.
Yeah, I think what happens sometimes when we start to hear stories about how the rich could dominate the poor is that in the person's head who's telling that type of narrative, there's like one ubiquitous rich. There's just one rich person,
Yeah.
right? When in fact there are many rich people who have competing interests. And then it's a weird move to go from, oh, the rich are going to do something to the poor, so we should have therefore the most rich, most powerful thing in the world, the government, uh, adjudicate all matters like this. It seems
Yeah,
like
but
a strange leap to
it
me.
is a strange leap, largely because and I'm not just doing this for Iceland, I'm doing this for other societies. The production of law, and I really mean law differently than legislation, and legislation is what legislatures do. Law is anything that provides governance and includes legislation, but it doesn't have to be legislation. So rules of politeness, rules of civility, civil associations, they all provide forms of law in the most strict traditionalistic sense of what law used to mean. In that case, you would have this kind of mechanism that would emerge out of common traditions for these settings. These would then be translated into codes, but like informal codes or scriptures or different types of ways to carry a knowledge of about how to cheaply adjudicate conflicts, create deterrence, and then minimize and then assure restitution. And in that case, the Icelandic example is one where it really kind of conveys away this idea that uh, that there needs to be a formalized order from the top down. It doesn't need to be, and it's not because we can't imagine it today that it didn't exist in the past. And the objections that people make towards this are very weak. I think the best objection, and that's the one where I think the studying the living standards is important, is saying that anarchy can generate sustained cooperation, which is true. There are settings where you do not need a state. There are settings where a state is inefficient. It would make things worse to have one. Uh, there are settings where uh, uh, anarchy can sustain cooperation and not be the most efficient alternative out there, theoretically speaking. The question is then, and that's the far more important criticism, is how do stateless societies compare to non-stateless ones at the same period of time or their comparables?
Mhm.
And that question is the one that's never asked. Everyone just goes on the feasibility of it, even though the more we study it now, we have the case of Iceland, but we also have the case of Acadia in Canada and the formation of the Metis tribe in the prairies. We have Russian settlers in the 18th and 19th century to the deeper east of Russia. We're starting to have a wide variety of example of societies that were largely stateless. We also have example of parts of societies today that are outside the reach of the state, where governance emerges, absence of state, but then people would say there's the shadow of a state or something like this. But nevertheless, we do have more and more example of sustained cooperation on very large scale in the absence of a state, which means that the only question we really must ask is, can it lead to sustained improvements in living standards, which is the only standard we should analyze anything by? And can it sustain itself over time? Is it like a durable experience? And that's where I think I say, yes, the anarcho-capitalists are crazy fucktard people. And I really mean this lovingly. I actually love anarchists in the sense that they're probably the most consistent thinkers and the most serious about understanding how institutions emerge. There's no hand waving in their story. I think there's wishful thinking when it comes to sustain, like the durability, but I don't think they do hand waving in the explanation. And the answer is for why I think they're somewhat crazy, but not that crazy, is that when we look at the living standard, and the Iceland case is one, Iceland compared very well with the society that was its nearest comparable, which was England, which had a state, but the weakest state of all states in Europe, for all intents and purposes, at the same time, and the Icelanders matched that. Then you compare with other societies with much stronger state, especially as you move towards the Mediterranean. There is no doubt that across a variety of available indicators, heights, so from skeletons give us a good indication of heights, because how tall people are is generally a sign of the quality of nutrition. So tall people, all else being equal, generally is a sign of wealth. So when we compare them to other Nordic people, they're very tall. When we compare them with the rest of Europe, they're exceptionally tall. Number two is we get, as evidence, we get massive in-migration. So generally people don't tend to go to places that make things worse for them. Number three is we can actually estimate real wages from the laws. So the difference, I want to say the tribe leaders dealt with each other. They actually left like deliberations, essentially. They're known as, I'm going to scrap the name, but gragas, which are the common law tradition, if you want. Like David Friedman would probably chide me for describing it as such, but I will just say it like to simplify. It's the common law tradition of Iceland, and we have like a repertory of the discussion. And in these, there's often mentions of prices and wages for goods and services. And so we can estimate based from this how many hours, how many quantities of each good you could buy in a single year. And what you find is that when you were looking at these, Icelanders bought pretty much as the Brits and sometimes more. So they had more purchasing power with their wages. We also have some other signs here and there, but generally the available evidence is very favorable to Iceland being quite a rich place. And then you can do it for other societies. I've done it with Rossellino Candela for the Acadians in Canada before the Great Upheaval, where they're deported by the Brits in 1775. But at the beginning of the 18th century, it is the richest place in North America by a large margin. It is highly peaceful as well. That's like every historian, when you read their stuff, they speak of exceptionally peaceful relationship between the Micmacs, the native Indians of the region, and the Acadian settlers, because they're trading. And so there's in the trade or raid logic, the setup of statelessness that was in Acadia led them to trade rather than raid, because there was no state to come and enforce violence. And so if you were bearing the cost of violence entirely by yourself, you actually had incentives to trade more. So you had a situation where the region was rich, the region was peaceful, and it ended in 1775 with the deportation of the French settlers. From there, same thing with the Métis of the Canadian prairies. They emerge as basically a smugglers group, for oversimplification purposes, who basically make by acting as trade intermediaries on the prairies, start making the prairies habitable for Western settlers. And so for 70 years, the emergence of the Métis is a form of governance in and of itself as an ethnic group that's creating more trade between settlers and other Indians. So you get this story that statelessness seems to lead to living standard. But the problem is all the examples I've given you, they end really badly. The Acadians end in deportation. Iceland ends up being annexed by Norway. The Mitsis basically end up being crushed by the early Canadian Confederation. In each state, the story of a stateless governance that lasts for many decades, in the case of Iceland, multiple centuries, it ends in disaster. So, whichever example you look at of statelessness, and Vladimir Maltsev is also doing great work on cases for Russia, and each time it ends up being incorporated. Or we find that when there are situations where the state is very weak, rather than being incorporated, they develop a state to respond to external predation, which is where I answer to Ancaps that they are crazy, is that it's not a stable equilibrium.
Right.
Uh,
I can see how the game theoretic problem becomes not so much what's going on within the ANCAP society, but just its vulnerability to outside predation, which
yeah,
obviously would still probably happen today, despite the fact that we like to think we're very civilized. It's unlikely that a particular state somewhere would turn down taking over some very successful society that can't defend itself from an outsider.
yeah, I
Yes.
would say it like that, but I would even go further than that. Is when people think about states, they think about states in development together. And you can think of it as a box with a 2 by 2. So, box one is you have a highly developed state and a highly developed economy. That is basically Canada, the United States, Ireland, the UK, France, Italy, pretty much all rich countries today. You can think of examples of very weak state and very low development. You would think of most of sub-Saharan Africa. You would think of Iran or Pakistan. You would think of nations that none of us would like to migrate to. Uh, um, and these would be the example of this. We can also think of some examples that lasted very long of strong states but low development. The USSR being one of them. Cuba, North Korea. You can think of examples like this. Francoist Spain. You have situations where states are really capable of doing coercion for very sustained periods, long and sustained periods of time, but eventually they maybe they collapse or they keep going well very long. But no one can name an example of a lasting weak state high development situation. And the reason why is there's two ways this can end is if you're rich and you have a weak state, people want to attack you. And the result is your living standards fall after conquest, which is what happened to the Acadians, the Mitsis, and the Icelanders. Iceland goes a period of demographic decline for pretty much every century until the 18th. The Acadians, needless to say, are deported, and that I think in and of itself the story is clear that it's a drop in living standards. And the Mitsis basically are destroyed for as a group. They're very much well not destroyed, but severely damaged, and many Mitsis just start re-identifying as they leave the group essentially because they feel that there's no point anymore in this. So it ends in every case in disaster. So that's one way it can end. Or the other one is you start building a state to resist predation. So the sentence that I tell ANCAPs is you guys are crazy because you don't understand that states are not necessarily they're not necessary per se, but they are unavoidable. So the question that we always should ask ourselves is how do we constrain the state to doing the things that it's able to do and that it's able to do best without hurting other people's right. And that becomes the public choice story of how do we generate constraints? How do we bind the hands of rulers to incentivize them to do the right thing? How do we get like the best type of state that's available, knowing full well that uh, the it's not possible to get the development without a state because it's not going to last.
Yeah, I think sometimes though, and just so you know, and I think I might have told this before, and anybody watching knows, I am an ANCAP in spirit for sure. Like I do know, I feel like if I know anything, I know that that would, let's take predation from other states aside, work better for almost everybody to have a market-based society where people have to bear the costs of their decisions. They have to rationally trade and make decisions and resolve conflicts with other people in society without resorting to political means. Um, I almost think that's like a tautology. If you could imagine all of that happening, that would be better. I do worry that I do think it's not possible right now. Like, I wouldn't want to start a stateless society this moment without all of the norms that should come with it, without any sort of mechanism for protecting that society. Because I have similar worries about that, like just a gang of people coming in there against a, a gang of very well organized people with a single goal coming in against an interspersed group of traitors that are not really talking that way. Um, but I'm not sure that it can't be fixed. Like, it seems to me like if people took the idea seriously, which they might, and I'll say why, and I think that in a second. Um, there can still be market mechanisms that would protect an ANCAP society from other states that we just haven't developed or tried or thought of. And I think maybe the reason that people might try more in the future to do that is like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I really love to get your thoughts about this. I know that correlation is not causation, but it seems like the countries that do the best at restraining their state and developing this private sector of decision making and planning just inarguably do better. So
Yep.
than the competition. And then I come to like, all right. Well, what is it? I can't remember if it was Brian Kaplan that said this or who said this, but it was like, how communists always say, well, real communism's never been tried. And capitalists also say, like, real capitalism's never been tried, but like almost real capitalism does a lot better than almost real communism, that type of
Yep.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I always like that joke, and it's a
Yeah.
really good one. Almost capitalism is really generally much better than almost communism.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a cheap shot because I tried to take the best argument possible on the other side, and
Sure.
I think only today people who like communism are generally political hacks or illiterate idiots. I'm sorry to say it like that. At this point in history, if you say that and you say it's not real one, well, no, not really. But if your reply is, well, you can't get what you really like, Vincent, like assuming that you think I'm a really hardcore ANCAP, well, then that's actually a fair criticism if it's made without invocation of the other one. But that being said, that's the correct answer is how do we get the better state? And that's actually like a much more productive question. But I will say one thing about statelessness before I answer that question, which is how do we get a better state, or at least one that's is constrained. And I'll mean also want to define what I mean by constrained. Um, all the cases of anarchy that I've discussed are cases where it emerged organically. So there was a process of experimentation with rules, tinkering, cases where there is state collapse. So I have a paper where, even though like I write with Peter Leeson, who is very, very fond of anarchy, uh, he has one paper where he calls it Better Off Stateless, the case of Somalia after state collapse. I'm using an empirical exercise with Kevin Greer, where right now the results are preliminary, so I could change what's in it, but right now the preliminary results show that actually, no, it didn't do better. So it's not that like Somalia had a really bad state. There was no way around that. The state was a horrible predatory state. And so maybe like the question Pete asked is maybe no state in that situation is better. And what we find is maybe no love is bad love is better than no love, which is
Right.
the title we have for the paper right now. So we do find sign that the state collapse actually made things worse. And that actually tells you that there is no way that these things can work without an organic process of experimenting with rules. Throwing people, and this is probably like the answer of throwing out existing rules because people adapt themselves to the presence of a state. They develop institutions around them. They develop rules of governance that are complementary to the state's existence. And if the state collapses, all of these previous institutions also lose their value. And so you have to restart from zero. And this is really costly. Unlike you start from zero rather than restart, start and restart being two different things. So this is one of the criticism I would make is actually state collapse probably would make things worse. Even in a situation where the state was already really, really, really bad, it's not necessarily, it's clearly, it was really bad. It was worse to get rid of it.
Yeah.
That leads us to the question is how do we get a better state? And that answer for me is always how do we constrain states? And this is where some people will emphasize the role of constitutions, the role of checks and balances, federalism. I don't think pieces of paper are that important. I think the biggest checks are generally de facto constraints, the ability of people to move, the presence of sometimes even ethnic tensions can be a check on government. The heterogeneity of population can be a check on governance. So the example I give, and this is pisses off because I'm from Quebec. So for those who don't know, I'm a total like born and raised Quebecer, which makes me weird given how free market I am as a Quebecer.
Yeah.
Is I say the weirdest thing is the group of people who's saving Canada as an entity right now are Quebec separatists, because each time the Constitution is just a piece of paper. The federal government has tried multiple times to centralize power much more towards it. Danger is each time they try to do too much, Quebec nationalists, who are no enlightened liberals who like civil liberties and individual liberties, each time the federal government oversteps, they threaten to do separation. The answer is that the federal government keeps itself in check and thus at the same time keeps the provincial government in check because the two of them counterbalance each other. So weirdly enough, the reason why Canada works is because there's a group of separatists in the province of
Don't
Quebec.
don't forget the West has got their own too.
Yeah, right now,
Yeah.
but that's probably
Yeah.
something that would help. But
For
notice
sure.
that
Yeah.
here, this
Yeah.
is not a paper constraint. It's not a paper constraint. It's not something that we wrote
No.
down and made a social contract about.
Yep.
It's something that's an effective constraint. So these are probably what matters in terms of one set of constraints that matters a lot. Beliefs are also very important. The American Constitution, I say that as a Canadian, I love it. I love it as a philosophical document, but the reality is the American Constitution is not particularly better or worse than
or
Canadian Constitution
or followed.
or followed. But
Yeah.
the Americans have something about it. They have a
Yeah.
cult
Yeah.
of the American Constitution. They invoke it in a nearly religious manner. And well, that system of belief creates a check. And this is what I mean by de facto constraint. These are things that matter much more. And the last set of constraints is not just that people can move and run around and escape a particularly bad state. It's also that we need to have little pockets of statelessness. And this is where innovators, people who create 3D printing, Bitcoin, back then before Ross Ulbricht was arrested. Why am I blanking on the name? I'm blanking on the name that he had. The Silk Road.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes.
Yes, where he was in prison. Backpage.com. All of these little pockets of statelessness, or underground music groups, or the internet in the early 90s. These were all pockets of innovation where people were creating communities that governed themselves in the absence of a state and were creating escape routes from from the state and thus limiting its power. And so this last part is probably the most important, is that probably the best checks on the state is that we keep running, and this is an analogy that's not mine. I'm borrowing totally from someone. You have a race with 3 horses for determining of living standards. You have the government horse, and you have the Smithian horse that speaks of the size of market. So this is the Adam Smith horse. And then you have the Joseph Schumpeter horse. And that one's the innovation horse. As long as the Smithian horse and the Schumpeter horse runs faster than the government one, we're okay. And that's what we should target. As long as those two run faster, they create escape rooms that create more effective liberty for people to try out things and create alternative methods of governance. And in the end, that matters so much more to determining of living standards. So that's why, like when you said earlier on, you said you had a sympathy for Ancaps. I do too. I just think that there is no very strong political agenda that you can build from this. The only, however, philosophical
Oh no, I
statement
agree. Yeah.
is, in fact, and you shouldn't follow any political ANCAP political remedies ever. But it does, the one that's clear is the only way to constrain governments to have them do what they're supposed to do best is, yeah, maybe good constitution, good constraint by letting people move around, having systems of belief that create alternative methods of governance that acts as a substitute to the state. Uh, but then number four, probably the most important, is those pockets of statelessness
Yeah.
that I'm talking about.
So yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you just said. I think how can I put this? Like there are a lot of examples of pockets of statelessness that even still have to do with the state in some of the richer countries you mentioned before. So for example, civil law, like just tort law or commerce is a lot less. I mean, it is affected by the state in some areas, but if you read case law from England from the 16th century, a lot of it's still running today. A lot of it, like you still learn all about it in law school, and it's because it's still good. Um,
Uh,
but generally, sorry, do you want to?
well, from what I remember, and this is something I got from, I think, John Hassness. Uh, if I'm not mistaken, one of the ones where that you have a lot of private part of this is maritime law.
Yeah,
Maritime law, because there's so many overlapping jurisdiction problem.
yeah,
The body of law, this is known as also it's admiralty law. Uh, it is so from, and now I'm summarizing other people's work, so this part is not mine,
it's okay.
but it is so the overlapping jurisdiction problem are so great that essentially what you have is maritime law is private law for all intents and purposes. And I just want to point out that the importance of maritime trade is gigantic.
Yeah,
The amount of trade that needs to be regulated, and most of it is regulated privately, is a pretty big deal. So you would find situations like uh, that it's totally sustainable. So when you talk about pockets of governance, yeah, and even today there's like large margin of the law that actually is. So
yeah,
there's like we can have arbitrage where we hire a private arbitrator, and by the way, a private arbitrator kind of has a reputation, whereas profit function is entirely determined by everybody believing that he is fair and equitable, and everyone will comply with the results of this and not go to court and thus invoke the formal legal system. These are, I think, in the case of maritime law, much more private than anything else. The arbitrage one, where you have mediators that come in, I think it's semi-private. So there's like shades of it, but the reality is we don't realize. And I think this is a paper by John Ashness that I really love, and I would invite anyone to read. He calls it the obviousness of statelessness, and the fact that if you look around you very carefully on a daily basis, the shadow of the state is not as big as we think it is. In your private relation with your partners, it isn't. With your relation with your kids, it isn't. In your professional relationship, it is maybe to some degree, but most of it is not. The amount of regulation of our behavior that actually happens, a large share of it happens entirely outside the ability of the state to do
well,
anything.
and a lot of what the state will do about your life too is codification of what private decisions were before the government decided to codify it. Right, like a lot of civil laws like that, commercial law, family law, a lot of it, yes, it's legislation now, but it didn't start life that way. It started life as like a body of judicial decisions that were reasoned out over centuries.
And well, I
And
wouldn't even say legal judicial decisions. I I understand that they're judicial decisions, but they're more of the amount of oral traditions. So think about like the first time like a case of somebody trespassing on a property. The first time it happens, there is no rule for this, and we're like, okay, so your cows trampled my crops. How do we deal with this? Then we have a discussion before an elder of the community, and he just looks at it, thinks about it, and then says, Vincent, well, you didn't do any effort to shield this, and you knew, and it was cheaper for you to know and deal with this than him deal with his cows, and thus we'll assign that the responsibility was on you to delineate your property because it was too expensive for him to figure it out. Like sometimes this is the way the rules are done. It could have
yeah,
been that they say the opposite.
Yeah.
where it says like, no, he had the cheapest kind of herding his cow, which is buy a dog to herd the cows, much
Sure.
cheaper than fencing an entire field. Then
Well,
the
sure. So
first time it
to
happens, the elder does it. Then it becomes a tradition. We refer to it henceforth. And then when we try to formalize this a bit more, when we'll say, okay, listen, we can't just go to the elder because before we were a village of 100, now we're a village of like a 20,000. Maybe it's okay to have a person that specializes only in this. And then things get written down. And then we call them judicial.
yeah.
But in reality, what they are is traditions and pieces of knowledge that have been conferred to us by the exercise of history for all intents and purposes. So you don't want to,
Right.
I wouldn't call them judicial.
Well, that's
I'm very
okay.
reluctant.
I don't even want to get hung up on that. What I want to do is like vigorously agree with everything you're saying, and what I'm saying is that the state gets a lot of credit for things it didn't invent, and a lot of times people perceive state intrusion into their life when in fact I think if it was a stateless society, the intrusion in many cases might be greater than what they get under the
Yeah.
state, right? They might have to bear more costs for their decisions. They might have to pay for that civil trial with including the judge, and that sort of thing, right? Um, so yeah, like I think the insofar as states operate well, they often piggyback on what was operating well before the state took it over.
Yes, and I think I would add something to this in what you're saying. So yeah, the
Mhm.
state likes to get credit for stuff it didn't
Yeah,
do, but sometimes it leaves us, it eliminates our ability to consider what was there before. And I'll use an example. So where I started my work on statelessness was weirdly enough working on lighthouses. Now it's boring for most non-economists for why an economist would work on lighthouses, but the reason why a lighthouse is something economists debate a lot is because it's considered the ultimate public good. Uh, no one when you produce the light in the middle of the night, you can't know who your clients are, and you can't charge them, and you can't prevent them from seeing it. The example from all textbook has been that you would never be able to have private production of lighthouses, thus you would not have sufficient maritime safety. So the state needs to do it, and it's considered the ultimate example of a public good because its feature as a good are in essence one of pure publicness and thus pure justification for state. Uh, People like Ronald Coase challenged that, showing that there was a lot of private production. Uh, but me and Rosalino Candela challenged it a bit more in a series of articles that were, I think I'm really happy about those because they landed pretty high. So I was pretty happy about this. Uh, but actually, that the state was, that when you look at the history of maritime security, most of it was not provided. The lighthouses were not important. The most important service was pilotage. Pilotage is much more important because you need so local ships have local knowledge of the waters, and so they know how to navigate. So they don't need really the lighthouse. Foreign ships kind of need it, but they also prefer to have someone board the ship and pilot it to port. Pilotage was much more important, and when you look throughout history, and you even find it in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, sorry, in the Homeric Odyssey. It's a lonely shepherd by the shore kindles is light, and basically it's a makeshift lighthouse that will not have survived history because it's basically like just a campfire that's signaling to ship that there is a pilot there. And then when you start digging in the history book, what you find is that most lighthouses that existed in the past were actually provided by pilots. And what pilots did is amalgamate at a certain point where they would drink together, be happy together, and not have to scour the waters for ship. They would just wait at a particular point, and the light would be there. A ship would see it, and it would signal the ability that there's a service there. And you actually find a navigational textbook that often pilotage station were involved with makeshift lighthouses. And these lighthouses were all pretty cheap. They weren't made to be those beautiful buildings like the Lighthouse of Alexandria or the beautiful, I'm forgetting the one in France. That's one of it's an archaeological wonder. Like to look at, it's a beautiful building, but it is also like a state creation made nearly all of marble
right.
as a joke. Like the inside has marble. It's like really beautiful inside. But these are magnificent building, but the state creates things that like were probably white elephants that didn't need to be that sophisticated
Yeah.
to provide maritime security. And so what happens is that we've lost the knowledge of how people used to do maritime security. Is they used to bundle a lot of services together. The pilotage, there was another thing called ballastage. They would bundle all these things together, and we forgot. Essentially, this was lost to economists that in history or maritime history, the lighthouse was not an important thing. It was not meant as it became important when the state took over and at the same time monopolized or created regulations for entry on the pilotage trade and it decided to monopolize the lighthouse. What happens is that we erased an historical piece of knowledge and then we're like, well, how would we do it without the state? Well, no, we were able to do it. And in fact, the solution lighthouses are now obsolete not because of the state, but in spite of it, because it's satellite technology. Trust me, most satellite technologies have very little to do with the state's involvement. So,
Yeah.
like what we ended up imagining as necessary was, and saying that we couldn't do it without it. So it's not just like it's a propaganda, like a propaganda campaign where you're saying, "Well, look how good we are." It's even that it does the job of erasing the possibility of an alternative. Then we're like, "Well, of course it has to be. There's nothing else."
Yeah,
And it's not true.
so you're touching on something that I have boy, if I had more time, I would really like to study this, which is this is just an intuition. I'm not making a strong claim here, but I think that this is a solid intuition. Every time the government makes regulations under an act of legislation, it adds different steps that people in the private sector must take a lot of the time when it's making these regulations. Um, and then people in the private sector, they will follow them, otherwise they'll get, sued into oblivion at some point. Um, but then what you end up with as you lose people who worked without those regulations, you end up with a workforce of people that are used to following these regulations and have forgotten why. So they'll know the rule behind something or that they're supposed to do something, but if you ask them where that came from or why that was like that, they often don't actually know. And so this actually makes people less understanding. They understand less about what they're doing, even if they're doing it. And then that requires more regulations because they start to go off the rails in a bunch of other unexpected ways because they don't really understand what they're doing anymore. Anyway, I've often wanted to do some analysis of that in Ontario for various reasons that I don't have time to explain or get into, but I think that this happens a lot in history, and I also think it creates neuroticism. What you're explaining, right? So like if we all of a sudden sit there wondering how something will get done, if only like if these 300 people in a building in Ottawa disappear, that's a little distressing, right? To think about. And then of course people are gonna have strong feelings about the government if they think that there's no other way to organize life.
I would say that there's two works I would recommend to your listeners here. One is Ludwig von Mises, and now I'm blanking on the exact name because I call it never its actual name. It's I call it the dynamic of interventionism, and I should look it up. Uh, and in the dynamic of intervention, essentially what Mises says is there's an impossibility of a mixed economy. Is each time you do a regulation, it creates unforeseen consequences that then fuel people to ask for more regulation to deal with the first round of problem. And so you gradually devolve towards a less continually less free economy. Now the model predicts like eternal, like every non-liberal society becomes like socialism. I think that's a bit too strong of a model. There needs to be like a reason why you could have a stable equilibrium, but something that's less great than the alternative, but where regulations would pile on. But one I think is much more interesting is, and this is Trevor Burrus's work, and he doesn't have a book yet, but you can find this on YouTube. He calls it the Statrix. And it's meant to say it's a pun on obviously the Matrix. And the idea is that once we start living in the presence of a state, our brains start being rewired. But not like by deliberate manipulation, but the fact that we stop observing alternatives. And so and essentially the idea is the cost of the state is the loss of our imaginations, that we are unable to imagine ways that we would do without it. So think about the government of Ottawa decides to build an extension to a rail metro, like let's say it had a tramway. I think it has a tramway now. Ottawa does.
Working on it.
Okay, let's say it extends to an extra line. People move to the particular district, and so there's people reallocated themselves geographically to this area, and then you're like, well, how would we do it without it? And so, well, people would say, well, maybe people would move further inside the city. Maybe there'd be Uber. Maybe there'd be more taxi services. Maybe there'd be small buses. And so, in this, the story by Burris is that essentially, the more the state intervenes, the more we can fail to imagine, the likelier it is that we fail to imagine alternatives uh, that end up costing us in the ability to actually uh, then create those alternatives and imagine itself. And in fact, I won't lie, the fact that I do economic history is one of the reasons why I think I've acquired a immunity to this, is the fact that I look at the behavior of people in the past, people who are much more capital constrained than we are, much more knowledge constrained than we are, and found immensely creative solutions to complex problems, very complex problem with great uncertainty, and they were able to. And so it tells me that like imaginative purpose, like the skill of imagination is something the state lulls and like makes wither away. And Trevor Burris's Statrix is actually like a good illustration of this, is that we lose the ability to picture our our skills to create solutions, and the result is rather than privately creating better alternative, is we as the state to add an extra set of services or add an extra set of regulations, and so the state grows by essentially doing this.
Well, and maybe not even just have the state add an extra set of regulations, but like maybe now I hate you because you don't want the state to add those regulations, right? And now psychologically, I'm very different of person because now I feel threatened if the state is doing something that I don't like or that you wanted to do or that type of thing. And so I do think it adds a whole layer of psychological trauma actually onto people. I was actually I was talking to John Murphy. I don't know if you know him or not. Is former George Mason guy.
Yeah, Nichols State's University.
That's right. Yeah. We were talking about Don Boudreaux, who I'm sure you know, or at least
A
know of.
legend.
A legend. Yes. I was explaining to
He's
him
my
how.
colleague. We see each other, and I think I see him as much as I like to see him. I think he sees too much of me.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I think I would probably do the exact same thing if I were you, so I don't blame you. Yeah, I was explaining to John how Don actually made me less angry as like an adolescent, basically, as a young man, because I started reading his Cafe Hayek and oh, wait a minute, the costs of things in the past were actually astronomical. I thought we were being screwed over here, but like a refrigerator would have taken, I'm making this up, a year of salary to pay for in 1946 or something. That date and amount is surely wrong, but this is why I get hope for anarchism, though, is that when you start realizing these things, you start becoming less neurotic and you start learning, like you said, you become immune a little bit and you start trusting that people will figure it out if they have to, right? I don't know
This
what you
is
think about
probably one.
that.
This is probably one of Don's greatest skills. I admire Don. He's been like the fact that I got hired here was for me like, oh my god, I'm working with people I've been reading since I was an undergrad.
Yeah,
And Don's one of his many great skills is the ability to convey facts very simply and do it in a way that actually breaks your brain a bit. For example, the one I always remember when people were talking about trade deficits, he would say, "You know what year the United States had no trade deficits? 1929." And you're like, "Oh yeah, that's not a great year, is it?" Uh, and
yeah,
this simple way of like presenting a fact changes your way of thinking about. And when you tell that, I've tried it on other people. So when Don says something, I often try it out on people who you could think of as pundits,
yeah,
and they see immediately that this fact hurts their narrative, even if it's a very simple fact. Like it's not a convoluted multiple step arguments. It's a very simple fact, and they're saying, "Oh, crap."
yeah.
Uh, and so the same thing I think would apply here. So I'm going to segue from Don. I'm using Don to segue to knowledge of the history of states and the history of anarchy. is it actually shows you that people are very good at finding solutions privately. And so maybe like the way to think about this is to change a bit our reasoning towards what we need for state for. So when we see a problem, the first question we should ask ourselves, and that makes it easier the more you do history to answer those questions. First question is this really a problem?
Yeah.
Right. So when somebody says it's a problem, it's like, really, is it a problem, or is it because you want to say to other people what you like most? Right. So let's just say this
Yeah.
clearly. Number two is, well, can the private sector do something about it? Is there a way to do private solutions to it? Yes, then don't do anything. Right. So if it's not a problem, don't do anything. The private sector can find solutions, then don't do anything. And then question three is, does the government put barriers in the way of the private sector for doing something? Yes, then get rid of those barriers.
Yeah.
Right. Try to remove them. Oh, the private sector. And then the last question is, well, if the private sector can't do it and there's no barriers, then yeah, maybe the state's intervention, or like, actually, there's a fourth question: is, does the state make things worse? So if it does, maybe just live with the problem. And then the last step, once you've answered all these four questions, is, okay, yeah, maybe we need the state to do X. This ability to answer those questions with precisions and good quality of facts, I think, is fueled by knowing history, by seeing the history of the state, the history of anarchy. And I won't lie, over my career, I've gone from being, I've always tried to answer those four questions, but my ability to answer like two and three and say, no, the private sector is really good at doing stuff. You don't realize how good it is, and how often what happens is there's just barriers in the way of people. So my answer, the same, I still use the same set of questions, but I've drifted in the probability that I will answer a
Yeah.
certain way or another.
You're updating your
But
priors.
yeah,
Yeah.
but the knowledge is, the knowledge of history and the history of the state makes you very much able to answer those the same way that Dawn breaks apart new facts in ways that people's priors change a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, is there anything else that you'd want to say about this topic that we haven't covered? Do you think that?
I've said pretty much everything. I can direct people to read. So,
Yeah, please do.
what you've heard is essentially the draft of a book that I'm writing. It's called The Nature of the Beast. And it is insane. Sorry, I have some words. So as a French Canadian, there's some words I have a really hard time saying out loud because my brain works in French, and so some
I understand.
language, some words are said in French. But it's part of a book that I call The Nature of the Beast: States, Growth, and Constraints. I'm not sure that's the name I'm going to keep forever, but I see it as a more serious and empirical version of mixing Murray Rothbard's The Anatomy of the State with more modern work by Person and Tabellini on political economics, by Dresden on political economy, or by Darren Acemoglu and others, so regarding the origins of state, and James Scott's as well. And essentially what you've heard is my pitch is, part one of the book is, so if people want to send me references, that's what I'm asking. If you have like stuff you've seen and you think I could use, I'd be super happy to. But part one is
You're getting
saying,
an email from me for sure.
so
You,
so part one of the book is how statelessness, actually, when you look at cases in history, matches the living standards very well. Is able to deal with problems that are often called market failures problem, regulation of commons, production of public goods, dealing with externalities. Stateless societies are really good at this. Part two is stateless societies always crumble. And so first part is that when they crumble in by conquest and how bad it is for living standards, or they build a state by to withstand predation. And then we do the same thing, but with internally. So not just external predation, but forms of internal predation. And so it's an anarchist origins of the state story. And then the last part is, how do you get those better states? How do you get states that actually are, since you can't, let me say it like that. So there's a debate known as state capacity, where people say that, oh, better states that are able to do stuff are states that generate economic growth. And my answer is, well, no, what you're able to say is that conditional on having a state, there are better states than other. No shit. So how do we get this new better state? Because you guys never answered that question. And this is where the islands of statelessness, the other reasonings are being built. So I'm finishing a few papers that are meant to be the empirical bits of this, but the story is essentially that. So the nature of the beast.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's definitely a book I look forward to reading. And
It's gonna, I'm looking for. I think it's gonna be another 2 years of work, but I'm much
that's
enjoying
okay.
writing it.
Yeah, it's I'm sure worth the wait. And one thing I think I appreciate about this conversation about your general attack at not attack, but your general take on things or the way you come at different problems is I love that it's so empirical and it's just so clear visioned. And I feel like you're the type of guy that, and correct me if I'm wrong, like if I could show you tomorrow a piece of data that you could analyze and test, and it showed you, hey, there is a way that anarchism is possible that wouldn't result in a new state, you'd probably take it into consideration instead
Yeah,
of
I
going
would.
exactly, instead of going like, oh, this must be garbage or something like that, right? And I just love people like that, whatever side of whatever issue they're on, that can actually update the way they think and won't just out of hand throw something out. So I really appreciate this conversation, and I'm looking forward to that book like crazy. You're sold one copy at least. So
That's at
yeah,
the very least. I know it's you're increasing the incentive to do more investments into it. But I would add that yeah, everything I do, I don't think anyone left or right would have a problem endorsing
exactly,
it. I try
exactly.
I try to make sure that regardless of your political opinion, you can read my stuff and end up agreeing with it. And you could still say, okay, I understand the nature of the state, and you could be a social democrat and then say, I think there's a way to do the welfare state in this way that X or Y doesn't create bad incentives for rulers. You could say that. I could disagree afterwards, but then we're moving to another conversation, which is policymaking. And
Yeah.
I don't really do policymaking. I'm not interested. I think it's the most boring part of what an economist does. It's boring, and not only that, it's not that important. So especially since most of the time when politicians call upon an economist, they've called upon him or her on the basis that they already know what the conclusion will be. So
Exactly.
there
Yeah.
is no enlightened part of the ruler's decision to be nice about it. So the part about convincing other economists or the general society by making points easily accessible, like the way Don does it so well, is how I'd go about it.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Okay, so unless you've got something else to plug.
I think I've said it all.
All right. Well, thanks very much for doing the podcast. I really appreciate it. I think this was a really good, tight conversation. So we're going to end it here, and I'll see everybody next episode.